And I think the paramount teaching in Orthodoxy, which is so profound for anybody who encounters it, is you have to take up your cross daily. And
Mhm.
what does that mean? What does it mean to carry a cross?
Mhm.
It's suffering. It's bleeding. And it's everybody around you looking at you like, what the hell are you doing? When I see God in the life of Christ. Okay, that is how the incomprehensible, infinite, unknowable God is expressing itself and showing us how to live. I left being bishop. I left the church completely, and it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life.
Stephen Hunter, hello, sir. Welcome to the show.
Hello, very good to be here. Thanks so
It,
much, Raphael.
it's a pleasure to have you, and we're very blessed that you agreed to sit down with us and have a chat. So, Stephen, you have a very fascinating story, and I want to really dive into that before we get into the different topics. But before we do that, can you give us just a little summary of who you are, what you're currently doing now, and we can take it from there. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome.
I was born and raised in Utah, a city in Utah called Ogden. It was kind of like this. It was this booming railroad town in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and uh, it was a really kind of an outlier. Like Utah is this extremely um, Mormon LDS culture, and Ogden was kind of like this kind of gritty, rough and tumble town in the middle of all of this like Mormon birth and growth, and so Ogden kind of maintained its own autonomy over the decades, and so it was a really interesting place to be raised because there you were kind of in a diverse place, like I mentioned to you when we talked last week. Like it was a massively diverse population in high school for me. There was a lot of Hispanic kids, a lot of African American kids, and so I was raised in that kind of environment, also with the really deep underpinnings of Mormon religious culture. So it was a really kind of uh, petri dish of all kinds of different things, and it was just a great environment to be raised in. And my parents were both very open-minded people who exposed me to a lot of different music and art and movies, and all the while being raised in Mormonism. We went to church every week, and we believed in the teachings of the church, and so did I. But I think from the very earliest memories that I have, I really was like interested in God. Like, what is God? What are we doing here? What's the point of all this? And so anyway, I guess we can get to that later. But born and raised in Ogden, Utah, kind of in that environment. Eventually graduated high school and went on a mission for the LDS Church to Perth, Australia, and served there for 2 years. And it was like this unbelievable experience, just being around all kinds of different people, talking to them about spirituality and religion, and uh, using the scriptures to try and convert them to your beliefs, and witnessing spiritual things unfold. As a 19, 20, 21-year-old kid, it was such an incredible gift in my life, and I loved every minute of that 2 years. And then came home from my mission, and got married pretty soon after, less than a year after I got home from mission, and married a woman from Colorado. And so we moved to Colorado, and I went to school there at the University of Colorado, and that was a really eye-opening experience. I'd always been interested in politics, and so I started a political science major and thought that was politics was the way to help the world and heal the world. And but I started one of my first jobs was an intern for a lobbyist, and he was a great guy, and but it was an awful experience. Like I hated lobbying. I hated the transactional nature of politics, and so I changed my major to English and film studies. I'm like, I'll just read books and watch movies for college, and I'll never work in politics. I'll never do it. And so I did, and that was awesome. University of Colorado was amazing, like super liberal place, right? And I I loved it. But I ended up, as soon as I graduated, we had had our first child, and the realities of life kind of settled in on me. And the first job opportunity I had was back here in Utah to work for a lobbyist. And so I ended up interning for a lobbyist here in Utah during the legislative session 2004. And it just set my career on this path. And this lobbyist became my mentor. And I started working in politics. And my first job was working on campaigns for people who, there was a big battle between credit unions and banks at that time. The banks thought that credit unions should be taxed the same way that banks are taxed. But credit unions are like, no, we're not owned by shareholders. We're owned by members. We're a nonprofit organization. And so there's this whole fight. And my job was to help candidates get elected that were credit union friendly. And so I had to work with Republicans and Democrats on their campaigns. And I learned so much about people. And like, I think most people judge politicians as narcissists, or they have some kind of weird neurosis about they want to control, and they want to get power, and that has just not been the case as I've worked with these politicians over the years. Yes, of course narcissism exists, and yes, of course people seek power, and they want to self-serve sometimes, but where their desire to work in politics or serve in politics comes from is like a really human place to do good. And so I think I learned through working in politics, especially on the campaign side, as you bleed and sweat with these people in their campaigns, you see them really struggling to try to make a difference. And they want to make a difference. They want to work for their community. They want to help their community. And man, that was just an overwhelmingly beautiful thing I was able to do for a number of years, and ended up working intensely on several campaigns, and ended up working with Mia Love, who became the first Black Republican Congresswoman elected from Utah. And she was amazing. That whole experience was amazing. It was intense, and was able to build my lobbying firm and start political consulting. And so I've been doing this for about 20 years now on the state level and the federal level, and have seen all the backroom stuff that goes on, and have learned so much about what drives um, government, how we get to points of decision making in government, and what influences those decision making processes, and why people fold, why people stand firm. It's been a lifelong lesson in how we try to hold up humanity through our governments and our systems and our institutions. So, but in the middle of all that, I've always been a deeply curious spiritual person. And so I've constantly been asking questions of myself, like, who am I? What is God? And so during this time of my career growth and experience, I was able to have lots of different spiritual experiences, including very, very wonderful experiences in the Mormon Church, in lots of different leadership positions, teaching Sunday school, um, and eventually became a bishop in the church, which is, you're over a congregation of about 500 people, and it's just the most beautiful experience to be able to work with people on a spiritual level, and really serve them and give your time and your energy to their spiritual and emotional well-being and physical well-being in a lot of cases. And so I had all this stuff going on. I was trying to be very active in the Mormon Church, and the Mormon Church is like most religions. It's got its rules and its boundaries, and I always, from a young age, really questioned those boundaries. So I was okay with like reading books that were not necessarily church related, and seeking experiences. Uh, so I would, uh, one time on my LDS mission in Perth, Australia, I met a Buddhist who was a former Mormon, and he taught me about Buddhism and Hinduism and the Bhagavad Gita and Eastern thought and the non-dual Advaita stuff. And I really was fascinated by Eastern philosophy, and but I didn't know how to integrate that into my Mormon life. I just did not know where that fit in Mormonism. because I think for most, I think most of Western Christianity, it's a very externalized faith. It's all about like, what are you doing on the outside of your life? Not really like looking inward and really finding out what causes thoughts, what are thoughts, what does it mean to operate from your heart? Like we Western Christians understand, oh, that sounds nice and that makes me feel good when I say that, but what does it actually mean to live from your
Mhm.
heart? I wanted to know those things. And so I would like secretly get on airplanes and go to meditation retreats and read all kinds of books and ask myself all kinds of questions. But there wasn't really any like community for me here in Utah to connect to. And sure, there were great friends that I had that I could share some of this stuff with, but it was really a really lonely journey spiritually to find these answers. And I think that's true for anybody who goes on the spiritual path. Like you just got to man up and do it alone. It's just how it is. And God sort of gracefully kind of leads you down this path. And so eventually, uh, of course, in my little spiritual search, I had read about psychedelics. Um, 2011 is when I started reading about psychedelics and started to get interested in what that was. And took me years of research and study. And then in 2016, I had decided to finally do it. So had a really beautiful experience with ayahuasca. It was very scary and hard to decide to do that. But when I did it, it really changed a lot for me. Um, but along the way too, like I had one of the most incredible experiences of my life. I was in 2012, I was really struggling with a lot of things, and I was on my way to Washington, D.C. in the middle of helping Mia Love with her campaign and all this stuff that was going on, like at a national level. A boy from Ogden, Utah, had no business being in the rooms I was in at that point in my life, but something felt off, and I knew what fell off to me was my spiritual life. And so literally I prayed for guidance. Like, God, I know I'm not aligned with you. What do I do? Where do I go? And I just prayed my heart out. The next day I get on an airplane to go to Washington, D.C. And I sit next to this guy in the airplane, and I try to avoid having conversation with him because, you don't want to be stuck with anybody for 3.5 hours yapping. But the second I took my headphones off, he started, "Hey, how are you? What are you doing? Oh, you're a lobbyist. Whoa, what does a lobbyist do?" And so started to ask conversation. Turns out he's the author of The Shack. I don't know if you've ever heard of the book The Shack, this really popular, wildly controversial Christian fiction book that came out in, I think, '07. And I mean, it's like top 25 bestsellers of all time. It had this huge impact in the Christian world. And I had read the book and it was really impactful to me. And I'm sitting next to the author on this flight. And the day after I say this prayer, like, God, guide me, give me a sign, and this conversation I had with him, it absolutely changed my life. Um, that that night, he said to me, if you want to be close to God, if you want to know who God is in your life, he said, Steve Hunter has to be at zero. And man, I really thought about that and went back to my hotel room and just poured my heart out to God. And I said, look, if I have to get to zero, then I'll get to zero. And sure enough, the next day was ironically my birthday in 2012. And God like leveled my life to zero. There was some, I mean, I told you my life had been a little chaotic. I had been busy building my business and being this awesome lobbyist guy, and I had forgotten God, and I had let myself um, get into some spaces and in my life that were not great, and that came back to bite me in the rear end that day, the day after I met Paul Young on that flight. And so from 2012 to now, I really have tried to commit my life to what is the will of God? What does God want for me? Whatever that is, I'll live under a viaduct with a tarp for my blanket, or I'll live in the 50,000 square. I don't care where I live. I don't care what I do. Just God guide me. And that's not an easy process, I don't think, for anybody. It's something that it's a continual process in your life. But I've been very committed to that, I feel, since 2012, and have just seen, psychedelics and meditation retreats and Tony Robbins events and everything imaginable. I have tried it. I have walked down the road, and um, then eventually, what happened in 2022 for me was it's a really long story. We can get into some of the details, but about I was a bishop in the LDS Church, and I was loving it very much, but a lot of concerns that I had had from a very young age about the church, and not even really anything to do with the beautiful spiritual teaching that the church offers about Christ, or even temple worship and families. There's a lot of really beautiful things about the church, but like the way the church is governed, and um, yeah, I had run into some really serious, deep existential things about my relationship with the church, and decided to leave. And so I left being bishop. I left the church completely, and it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And then my mom passed away suddenly, kind of in the middle of this little 3-year window I've been in, and I really went into the dark night of the soul. Um, and then earlier last year, it's kind of a miraculous story, but Orthodox Christianity just showed up for me in a really miraculous way, and I spent some time at a monastery and met with Father Paul, who you've had on your podcast, and I was baptized an Orthodox Christian in October of last year. So kind of all over the place, but that's like I don't know however long that was, 10-minute journey.
What I found so fascinating about your story was that um, even though you had this a community around you in the Mormon Church, you felt very lonely, and I think so lonely, in fact, that you mentioned you couldn't even talk to your wife about these experiences because of the restrictions that are put in by the Mormon Church. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What are those restrictions, and why do you think they're there?
Yeah, I don't think that like the church itself is the one that is restricting. I think it's culture, right? It's the
Uh
way
huh.
that, I mean, you talk about Jesus showing up at a time when, like, he didn't say anything bad about the laws that were given, the Mosaic, like he wasn't bashing the law. He was bashing the cultural world that had been built around the Mosaic law, right?
Mm.
The obsessiveness over it. And that was cultural. That wasn't had nothing to do with spirituality. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what happens in any religion. And I think what's happened in Mormonism is that there's sort of, I think especially in a church like Mormonism that's kind of like evolving doctrinally and with its teachings, and it changes its manuals all the time, and you'll have a different leader of the church that comes into power when one dies. And so you get kind of, the ground is always moving beneath you, but there's also eternal principles, like God exists, God is real, Christ is real. Those things don't change, but like the day-to-day of how you're like, is it okay to drink coffee? To some people in the Mormon church, it's evolving to a place where like, yeah, it's okay. Other people, it's like if you touch coffee, you'll burn in hell. Like,
Mm.
um, so I think that's what made it hard to communicate these things, to a spouse. Uh, you just, and I think a lot of people are like that in any religion. If you're on a spiritual journey on your own and your spouse isn't aligned with you, or they're really okay with whatever your religious paradigm is and you're not, how do you do that together, and
Mm.
how to be honest about your own personal journey? So I think the influences from aren't like directly from the church, but they come from the culture that builds itself around a church. So, you know, drinking, drinking coffee, watching R-rated movies is a debated thing in Mormonism. And but even though like you go outside of the US and there's not even R ratings, like there's completely different ratings. So
Mm.
movies that would be okay to watch in Australia for Mormons would not be okay to watch here. So like we put these really black and white boundaries around something in religion culturally, but God kind of like shows us there's like, well, there's not just black and white. There's nuances to every person's situation and everybody's different. So I think it was more of my inability to to be vocal about what I believed because of the cultural pressure I felt rather than um like my spouse feeling obligated to be, you know, kind of a militant person about some of the rules.
I
I
see.
think fear of not going to heaven. You know, in Mormonism, it's all about the family. Like your family is eternal, and everything in Mormonism is about having an eternal family and keeping that eternal family faithful and enduring to the end in this world so that you can make it to the highest degree of glory with God. And so I think there's a built-in fear, like, man, if I don't have that, geez, that's terrifying to know that for eternity I might not be with my family. Like if if I drink or I commit a sexual sin or I watch movies that are inappropriate, like I'm putting at risk my my eternal salvation. So I think those things are far more impactful than like any specific thing the church does.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I do, I do think that makes sense. My encounter with Mormons has been that they're always amazingly nice people, all of them. I have not met a Mormon that I think is not nice. One of the things that struck me a lot in those conversations, though, was that when we were discussing scripture, for example, and you're trying to bring in different books or different pieces of literature that may help you make sense of the symbolism of the story, right? Um, they it's not that they shy away from the conversation, but I did notice that they were getting a little bit uncomfortable because they were not allowed to read other books and they were not allowed to go into the internet, and so there was a lot of restrictions with what they could and couldn't read. For me personally, that felt very different from a lot of the Orthodox, the Orthodox priests, for example, that I've talked to, because they're extremely well educated and they read, you know, Carl Jung and all of these different people to try to get a more a firmer grasp on the teachings of the Bible. Is that something
Mm.
that you noticed when you were as part of the church as well? That sort of prohibition of certain content.
Oh yeah, I mean, like, you know, as a missionary, you're giving a really specific uh number of books that you can read and you can't read anything else. And but again, those are rules. Um, and so you always distinguish like, well, what are rules versus commandments? What is God's law versus what my like priesthood leader is telling me to do? And that's kind of a conflict for Mormons all the time is, geez, like it's probably okay if I do this, but is it because it's something that's recommended by my priesthood leader or a church leader? Is that coming from God? What is my own ability to decide for myself? It's a constant conflict that's going on. And so people are trying to sort. So then what I think you where you land is a place where um, LDS people are really they're really nice. So what I've seen in Mormons, it's evolved to this place now where like, hey, look, God loves everybody and everybody's going to be saved and it's all going to work out in the end as long as we're just really good people. And so I can be Mormon and believe that the Mormon Church is true, and you can be Catholic and believe the Catholic Church is true, and you can be Muslim and believe that Muhammad is the true prophet. Like that's all awesome, and we love all of that. So it's almost like the niceness uh, instead of conviction in what you really believe.
I
Because
see.
the problem with the church is modern revelation. Like you have a new prophet every time someone dies, and so a new president of the church will take over when the next one dies. And so it's about their personality and the way that they see the church, and so Mormons naturally believe, okay, well, he's a prophet of God, so whatever he says goes. When really it's like it's his personality, it's his way of doing business, it's his way of
Mhm.
being spiritual that really influences the rest of the church. And so it's hard when the ground is always moving beneath your feet to have conviction. And I think that's what's so beautiful about Orthodoxy to me is, yeah, I can read Carl Jung, and I can read all of the Muslim scholars and the beautiful Arabic literature that was written 1500 years ago about, Sufism. I can read all of that because I know the conviction that I have in my relationship with Christ and the simplicity of that. Like, that's what I stand for. I stand for receiving communion. I stand for the divine liturgy. I stand for uh, what Christ's words were in the gospel and how to live in this space of the prayer of the heart. Like, I know what I stand for. And I think Mormon niceness is a whole thing. And it's a mask that's worn to really not get into the tough stuff, to not get into the dirt. And the spirituality is difficult. It's yucky, it's dirty, it's messy. It has to be, because the old self has to die. And if you're going to kill that old self, you got to go through some really, and you got to look at the opposite, the things that you don't believe, and if you're unwilling to do that, you just won't evolve past like an egoic way of living.
Yeah. And that's the part of the story that I also think is really fascinating. So you hit a spiritual pitfall, so to speak, and then you are in a room. All of a sudden, the TV turns on, and you
Mm.
get this video about orthodoxy. So what happened there?
Yeah, so um, right at the time that I had decided to leave the Mormon Church, I was working with a really dear friend of mine, Damien Eccles, on he was on death row for 18 years unjustly, and he's an innocent guy. Just amazing, like the most humble, amazing person I've probably ever met. I mean, imagine what that experience does to you,
Mm-hmm.
and how you learn to center yourself after 2 decades of being on death row. It's unheard of
Yeah.
horror. And so he and I had connected because of this uh, crazy idea I had to reach out to him and have him come speak at a thing. And he taught me a lot about what it means to go inside, and his own spiritual work that he did in prison and continues to do with, like, and breath work and archangel magic and understanding like the invisible realm around us and what that means and how to integrate that with our life. That came into my life right at the time I had decided to leave the church. And um, we we were doing some research back east on this TV show we were working on at some of the church history sites, and there was some conflict there with the church, and it was just kind of last straw for me. So Damien was this really important piece of my life, and I bring that up because Damien is this incredible spiritual person who's just unbothered by anything, and what he taught me, I started to try to practice in my life, like open myself up to what is going on inside of me, and like really do the work, close the door, you know, um, turn the lights off, and not just meditate, but like breathe your way into your understanding of who you are, and use some of these ancient tools that have been around for centuries. And I really started to do that, and I could feel my life changing. Like, things just started to change for me, and it felt nice at first, but then it really started to get dark,
Mm-hmm.
and I could see things that used to be so important to me, like things I really used to care about. You used to get so motivated to be into this thing or that thing, or friends that I used to be really close to. Things just started to slowly fall out of my life, and losing that, it felt like death. And especially the church, right? Like, the church was such a big deal to me. It was everything to me and everything to my family, and it really impacted my marriage, and uh, literally everything in my life started to fall apart. And even my own connection with my political life and work that I was doing, it was just hard for me to find meaning in it. And I was kind of aware that this is part of the spiritual path and that it was necessary, but I also kept trying to like pick myself up
Mm-hmm.
and move forward. And then my mom died out of nowhere, and she in my entire life has been this this incredible influence for me, just nothing but love. And she herself really struggled with darkness in her life. She was an addict for a number of years, drugs, alcohol. Um, but she always gave everything to me as her, as my mother. And when she died suddenly, I mean, it was kind of like this last thing that happened to me in the middle of this 3-year period where I'd lost my identity in the church, lost my identity with my family, lost my identity with everything that I knew. And then when she died, it really started to slip away from me. Like I didn't have any ground anymore to stand. I had nothing. And and then and then I started like trying to build a life coaching business, which is up and going now. So I started Jungian life coaching, and you know, anybody that listens to this that's ever read Carl Jung or understands what Carl Jung is trying to get us to do is to individuate, right? And you're trying to merge the dark and the light, the alchemical process of becoming a whole person is terrifying. And Jung says that, like it's a terrifying thing that you have to do this work. And I started to lean into that, and the more I leaned into it, it just got almost impossible. And so in June of this last year, I was I was in my little apartment, and I could not get out of bed for 2 days. I don't know what had happened to me. I'm a really jovial, like happy person. I'm Mormon happy. You put on the smile all the time.
Mhm.
You can be a great actor when you want to be. Um, but I had just arrived at a place in my soul and in my mind where everything was black. And the kind of blackness that you can't describe to somebody, but someone who's been through it knows it. And I just didn't know. I didn't know what was happening to me. And I reached out to some therapist friends, and the best thing they could do is like, call this hotline if you're really in trouble.
Mhm.
And you're like, yeah, that's not gonna happen. I'm not doing that. And anyway, in the middle of the night, on the second day of just not being able to get out of bed, I literally heard the words, "You have forgotten Christ." And I didn't know what that meant even. So the only thing I could think to do in the middle of the night was get up and watch an episode of The Chosen. And so uh, I watched an episode of The Chosen. It was really, really beautiful experience. It felt nice, um, but I could still feel this hollowness in me, And so I'm like, well, I guess I'll just go back to bed and lay there and look at the ceiling. And as I got up to walk away from my TV, YouTube accidentally flipped on, and the very top of the feed was a video that just said theosis, the true purpose and meaning of life. And I just watched this unbelievable depiction of what theosis is. And theosis is um, it's an Orthodox teaching that theosis is about becoming one with God, through God's grace. And everything in that video was everything I had believed my entire life, but had never seen in the external world. And so I just decided, like, well, I guess I've got to go figure out what Christian Orthodoxy is, because I thought I had looked into every religion possible on earth, and I had never. Of course, I've looked at Catholicism but never Orthodoxy, and I did. That's what happened. That's what happened.
So then what happens after that is you decide to go into the monastery, right? When you're driving your son up to California. Well, actually, you contacted Father Paul at that point in Utah,
Yeah.
and he had referred you to the monastery in California. And it just so happened that it was about an hour, maybe 2 hour drive from where your son was going to college, right?
hmm Yeah. So uh, I didn't know what Orthodoxy was, so I just Googled like Orthodox Church Utah, and it took me a few weeks to finally meet the priest at St. Peter and Paul's Church here in Utah, and when we finally sat down to meet, um, like I had sent Father Paul, like one of the things that happened in 2022 was Rolling Stone magazine had reached out. They were doing a big article about Mormons who had found psychedelics and were using that in their post-Mormon life. And I really felt like it was incumbent upon me as an active member of the church to say, like, look, if you're Mormon and you feel like psychedelics would be helpful to your relationship with God, like you should feel free to do that and talk openly about that. So I agreed to do this interview with Rolling Stone, and that's kind of what led to the beginning of the end for my relationship with the church. Like they were not happy about that interview, and um, anyway, that was a cool experience. But so I sent Father Paul that article, um, and we talked for a little bit, and he just was like, "Yeah, you've had an interesting little road," and then he just said out of nowhere, he's like, "You think you could go to this monastery?" And I said, I don't care where it is. Yes, of course I'll go. And it just turns out I was taking my son 2 weeks later to college. He's plays baseball in San Luis Obispo in college, and I was dropping him off, saying goodbye to him. He's 18, he'd be a freshman in college, and so that's a whole emotional thing in itself. But the monastery was near the uh, was near where I was taking him, and so that experience. I don't want to talk too much about the monastery because the monastics are really they're they're monastics for a reason, right? Like that's a very sacred environment, and I just want to protect that as much as possible because I respect and love them so much. But it changed my life i- in such powerful ways. You know, getting up and going to liturgy at 3 a.m. in the morning with nuns and um, what is that? Like, what are icons? Like, what are these crazy pictures you see on the walls inside of these church? And what is all this? How come they sing everything in their services? And why does that resonate with me? Not in an emotional way, not in the way that I think we're taught religiously or spiritually to like, we want these big experiences like rock concerts and emotional, tear-filled things. Orthodoxy is not like that. Orthodoxy is very subtle and and you can't put words to it. You have to experience that subtlety by going into an Orthodox church a number of times because it has to kind of wave over you and you start to think differently. You start to unlearn the way that you've been taught to think. And that's really what the spiritual process is you're not being governed by the world. None of us are. We're governed by this spiritual realm. And that's where we'll go after this life. That's where we come from. That's who we are. But the world teaches us all this external stuff and it gives us all these memories. And so all we have is our past. And so our mind constantly is trying to hook us into this egoic way of living. What about me? What about my security? What about, and I think Orthodoxy really leans into the fact like, why do you worry about any of that stuff? God's in charge. Like, you know, pray, be humble, listen, be still, and watch God do wonderful, grace-filled things in your life.
Um, okay, so then you go to the monastery, you get baptized. Um, what outside of obviously helping you get yourself out of the abyss, what were the most fundamental difference that immediately stood out to you as you were exploring the teachings of the Orthodox Church in comparison to anything you had seen from, let's say, Catholicism or the Mormon Church, for example?
Mormonism.
Yeah.
Um, what immediately stands out to you in Orthodoxy? So for me, I don't know if you're familiar with Matthew 6, but Matthew 6 is like my favorite chapter of Scripture, and it has been forever. Um,
Write
where
that down.
Christ says that, take no thought for the morrow.
Mhm.
Um, Look at the lilies in the field and look at the birds in the air and see how much they're taken care of and how much more are you loved by God as a human being. And you think that God won't take care of you
Right.
way more than the birds in the air or the lilies in the field? And like, there's a massive disconnect in Western spirituality with that kind of thing. It's like you nobody knows what it means to like take no thought for the morrow. How do you do that? Well, I have a job. I have to clothe my children. I have to clothe myself. I have to eat. I have to like, what do you mean take no thought? You know?
Mhm.
So orthodoxy literally takes no thought for the morrow. That's what stood out to me. And the evidence of that is in, you know, meeting actual monastic nuns and reading about the lives of saints, like contemporary saints that have given their life to Christ, watching their practical day-to-day life, uh, and the fruits of that being absolute divinity, like the way that they help people, the way that they are able to heal people, the miracles that they work. Uh, that to me was what stuck out so much, was because my whole life I had wondered, what does it mean when Jesus is in the boat sleeping and the storm is raging, and he stands up after his disciples are like, Jesus, the storm is raging. What are we going to do? We're going to crash. We're going to die. And he's like, calm down, and he stands up in the boat, and the sea calms. The storm dies down. What does it mean to take no thought for the morrow? All of those questions, like as much as I wanted to believe in Mormonism and tried to, like there were never any examples of that in my midst, or real teachings about how to do that. It's almost like, oh yeah, those are really beautiful words. Like, of course, Christ, that's amazing. But I'm like, well, Christ is telling us to live that way. Like, why aren't we figuring that? Why aren't we doing that? You know? Um, and then here it is in Orthodoxy. Like you can see saints in our time that and their saints before them and their teachers before them. It goes all the way back to the time of Christ. And so it's not priesthood authority the way that you're taught in a lot of Christian religions, especially in Mormonism. Like the handing down of priesthood authority is the most important thing. It's the life of Christ that gets handed down over these centuries in Orthodoxy. And so the way people live and the way they infuse themselves with God and become, godlike with a little g in their own lives, that produces miracles. It produces peace. It doesn't give way to whoever is president of the United States or whatever the coolest new social media app is. It doesn't care about any of those things because it's able to show you how to live when the storm is raging and you can stand up in the boat and calm the storm. It literally teaches you how to do that through examples of contemporary people. That's what stood out so much to me.
I see. I see. So it gives you the spiritual foundation by which you can overcome the inevitable consequences of the flawed choices that we will always make, on top of the, I guess, the inevitable hardships that come with a human life. Is that a good way
Yeah.
to conceptualize that, you think?
Yeah. Yeah. And in Orthodoxy, they're like, thank God you have hardship. Like that's the greatest blessing you can have is a
Mm-hmm.
hardship
Mm-hmm.
because it's detaching you from like this obsession with the outside world. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I have to have this amount of money, or I need to manifest my beach house in Hawaii. Like
Right, right,
those
right, right.
kind of like new agey spiritual things are not spiritual at all. What is spiritual is suffering. And I think the paramount teaching in Orthodoxy, which is so profound for anybody who encounters it, is you have to take up your cross daily. And
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? What does it mean to carry a cross?
Mm-hmm.
It's suffering. It's bleeding. And it's everybody around you looking at you like, what the hell are you doing? Like, why are you? No one will understand you. But you have this purpose in life, and that purpose is love, and to encounter love and be love and have that relationship with God. And you do that through suffering. So suffering is the gateway to peace, which is a totally like flipped on its head teaching, I think, and it's revolutionary for anyone's life.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. And I think um what is, I think, sometimes difficult for people to understand that are outside of Orthodoxy, or that haven't really dived into what the teachings mean, is that, when you say, worry not of what happens tomorrow, people sort of think like, oh well, you don't have a plan, or maybe you shouldn't, like, you can't be putting your trust in God. You have to take, sort of pick yourself up from your bootstraps and go out and do something. I The way that I understood it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that yes, you still have to show up every day. You're responsible for what you do that day, right? You're responsible for waking up on time. You're responsible for making the phone calls you need to make, for sending out the job applications. But the way by which what you're looking for manifests itself is completely out of your control, right? The
Yes.
way by which the hardships are relieved is completely out of your control. So that's sort of why what I understand by it. It's not is that you gain control by relinquishing control to something greater than yourself. How does
Mm.
that sit with you?
Yeah, it's perfectly. And the thing that you're relinquishing yourself to is an unknowable thing.
Yeah.
Like God, God is so vast and incomprehensible that you're just our humanity is not going to ever be able to comprehend it. And so like there's a great peace in that.
Mhm.
Like, God isn't something I can wrap my head around, but I can when I see God in the life of Christ. Like, oh, okay, that is how the incomprehensible, infinite, unknowable God is expressing itself and showing us how to live on this earth is through the life of Christ. So then it actually becomes very relatable because God for all of us is like no matter how hard we try to fit him into a box or her or whatever we believe in about God, we can't do it. It's
Yeah.
impossible. You can touch it for a minute and you think you got it and then it totally evaporates. It doesn't work, but you can because here is this person who came to earth and suffered and lived this incredibly deep, meaningful life and cut himself off from the world. And by doing that, he was given life. And by us doing that, we receive life.
Mhm. And one another thing that I recently came to understand of this very new age manifestation teachings is that it's all about the desires and it's all about the self, right? So it's like you can manifest whatever it is you want, and then when you start looking into the teachings of orthodoxy, you realize that there is something, I don't know if demonic is the right word, but it is a little diabolical. And I mean diabolical because it actually separates you from God, right? Now, there's other
Mm,
people that call it source or whatever have you, but I feel that they use it for the purpose of their own self-aggrandizement and building wealth. And I think they often forget that the wealth doesn't even really matter. What matters is what you had to do to acquire it because of the type of person that calls you to be. And
mm,
then, and that's sort of what I feel that God does for you. He doesn't give it to you in the sense that you pray, you open the door, and there's like a box with $1 million in it, right?
mm,
It's more of you pray that He will show you the way, and He will help give you the strength so that you're able to walk it by yourself. Because at the end of that journey, the strength that you acquired and the person that you were forced to become is by far over supersedes any material wealth that you could have accumulated, as a consequence of that. Do you think that that's also a good way to think about what God calls you to do?
yeah, and I think like I mean we had a kind of a brief conversation last week when we met about what is like why is Satanism a thing? Like what is this? And it really is the worship of the self. And 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 I think that all of this new age spirituality, manifesting and chakras and kundalini and um you know uh all Neville Goddard and whatever Tony Robbins, Joe Dispenza, all of these different entities that are teaching this way to create your own life. I think that's a place people end up on the spiritual path if they're seekers. And like any part on the spiritual path, you can choose to stop there and stay there.
Hmm.
But the worship of the self, eventually it has to come to an end
Yeah.
because it's not eternal. And so I think what real deep spiritual seekers run into eventually is this encounter with the manifestation of your own reality, or or realizing what are my desires? Where do they come from? And you have where you really lean into that and you understand, well, my desires are really something that have been placed in me by all of my external worldly experiences over time.
Hmm.
So my desires come from memories, they come from movies that I've watched, conversations that I've had. And so like I think I know what I want. So I'm going to try and picture that in my head and try and create that, but that's an exhausting effort. It's truly an exhausting effort. And I think you realize that if you go far enough down the path, but once you hit the end of that road, when there is no more self, that's when it really gets hard because you'll want to go back to that because when there is a self, you can at least like put on a spreadsheet like this is my income, this is my vacation for next month, this is, you know, your mind wants this security, your ego wants this security, but the truth, God, your spirit, it's already secure. You already are everything that you think that you need. You already have all of it. And I think that's what Christ is trying to explain to us. And like, look at the flowers in the ground and the birds in the air. Like, are you kidding me? You're a human being. God loves you so much. Like, there's no way he's ever going to let anything happen to you that isn't exactly what is supposed to happen to you. And what is supposed to happen to you is the greatest thing that can be given to you. Far greater than a house in Hawaii, far greater than like a perfect wardrobe or an amazing job or, you know, infinite money. Like what you are supposed to be, what God is trying to show you is far more rewarding and fulfilling than anything we can do with ourselves.
Well, and I think that a lot of those, um, the new the like the new age teachings and other people you mentioned, it's all about the acquisition of wealth, right? It is all that's how I mean, because I've explored that at length, and it always comes around like getting that vacation, getting that car, getting that perfect relationship, getting all the money. And I think one of the misconceptions of a lot of people when they look at the teachings of Christ is that, well, wealth is bad, and it's not good to have a life of financial stability and these sorts of things. So it's sort of like, here's what I guess this is what I'm trying to say. I think that the New Age takes it to one extreme, and the religious fundamentalists take it to another one. So as to say, well, you're not supposed to have wealth because money is the root of all evil. Um, but I think that the middle ground between that, as far as I can tell, is to say the wealth that I acquire would be only for the purpose of doing God's work on this earth. That's the way that I see it a little bit more, rather than it's because of my own selfish desires, or maybe I shouldn't have it because again, money's the root of evil. Where do you sit on that scale?
Yeah, I think that's where you have to get to that place because whether you live in a single wide trailer or the biggest mansion on earth, you're going to be okay with it because you know that you've asked God, this unknowable force that is so loving, so incomprehensibly loving that it's incredible. And when you allow that to flow through you, it will take you so that you understand everything that I have, I'm supposed to give away anyway. Like, because any material gain that I get, I've got to share that in order for me to be fulfilled, in order for the world to benefit. Like, material wealth is not to be held on to and hoarded, and it's a very temporary thing that should be shared to fulfill temporary needs. And so if we take that approach to it and understand that whatever blessings we get in the way of material will are only for us to give away.
Mhm.
So that's kind of where I think, and I think spirituality really will lead you to that path.
I agree. I agree. Okay, let me take a bit of a shift here. Um, so you're in lobbying, and you've been doing it for a very long time. You understand the political process better than, I would say 99.9% of people. And I want to get your perspective on whether you think that the political process that we have now, in the way that it's been used, twisted, manipulated to serve the individual purposes of either individuals or corporations, has a spiritual foundation. What I mean by that is there a spiritual conflict that happens underneath all of the surface level politics that we're all exposed to?
Um, well, I think every person that decides to run for public office has inherent uh, deep spirituality in them, and that spirituality manifests itself in the desire to serve
Hmm.
and to do good. So I don't care what you think of Kamala Harris or Donald Trump or your local city council person or your local county, whatever. Like, it does not matter what you think of any of those people. If you don't judge them for some of the things they do and look at them as human beings. It was funny. I was watching Russell Brand a few weeks ago and he was like, he was kind of making fun of Vice President Harris, and but he said something really interesting. He said, "Look at her eyes. There's kindness in her eyes." And and so here's Russell Brand, like obviously this Trump guy and kind of like this Republican, like born again Christian dude, and so anyway, my point is, I think we have to walk into an understanding of politics with that belief, which is that everybody has kindness in their eyes. Everybody is in it for the right reasons, at least initially. And what happens is you have a system that's perpetuated itself for so long and is controlled by such an enigma of forces that it eventually swallows up most of the people that get involved in politics, or the good ones just like tap out and leave. And so uh, I don't know that a system created by man can ever bring fulfillment or peace to the world. And I think that's what I've learned in politics is that however much we try, and we should all be engaged as much as possible. But if service is not the reason why we're being engaged, if it's service, then I think that the outcomes of our efforts will be fulfilling. But if it's self-oriented, like you're trying to steal from me, or you're trying to like, you know, put this housing development in my neighborhood, and I'll go to hell if that ever happened. Like if you have that mentality, it's already like this combative, confronted. Like I think that's where it goes wrong. And there's a really cool documentary out right now. It just got released called "Soundtrack to a Coup d'Etat," and it's about the history of in the '60s when all of these really incredible jazz musicians went over to Africa, and there was sort of a CIA uh, sort of underhanded plot to use these jazz musicians to help influence the outcomes of all these, these new African formed countries. And at the root of all of it was like uh, the need for the uranium deposits in Congo. So the outcome of the Congolese election was really a big deal. And how did Russia play a role in it? How did America play a role in it? How did China play a role in it? And what ends up happening, of course, is Africa was on the cusp of becoming the United States of Africa, sort of an autonomous, African space for African people, ran by African people, not the Belgians, not the French, not the Americans, not the Russians, And of course, what happened is the West's influence won at the end of the day, and chaos ensued, and destabilization of that whole region occurred, and um, that to me is the dark side of politics. What happens when we believe that systems know better, that God ordained America above all the other countries to be the most special, important, wonderful country on earth where all the good things are going to happen. When we start thinking like that, that's trouble, you know, and you see that like when you're on the ground working in politics, whatever issue you're working on, when people start to elevate their own beliefs over another instead of like trying to understand what the other person is trying to accomplish and then starting from that point, it gets really, really bad. And and that's kind of where I think we find ourselves in America now is we're really, really lost. Like what is our goal? Like I want good to be done and I'm a good Christian person or I'm a good spiritual but I hate Kamala Harris. Like, well, why? You know,
Mhm.
why do you hate her? Well, because she wants to, you know, tax my capital gains, or she wants to, you know, give more money to this program that I hate. Like, well, that's not a reason to hate somebody, you know.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, and I always felt like, I mean, I think it was clear that she was not really well prepared, and maybe she didn't know as much as she should have to run for president of the United States. But I think a lot of people would agree that there was something nice about her at the very least, right? Like, should she be running for president? I don't know. Would I love to go to a bar and have a drink with her? Yeah, I think she'd be the type of person that would enjoy a conversation with outside of anything political, right? So, and I think a lot of people are like that. Regardless of their political ideologies. What I do see happening quite a bit is I see that sometimes people's political ideologies become their personality, and
mm,
then they see everything through that lens, and then they see all these different groups and identities, and they see a group of people that in their view is disenfranchised because it's a hierarchical system that's run by a particular race of people that are intrinsically evil and racist and bigoted and all of these different things, and then that's the lens that they use to look at everything. And then for me, well, it's no wonder that's all they look at, because that's all they're thinking about, right? So
mm.
for those people, which seems to be quite a few people in our country today, is it also the fact that they're missing the point, it seems.
Well, it's why like you you can have whatever opinion you want about Donald Trump, but we we created Donald Trump because
I agree.
like the exact reason that you know and we were talking about this earlier too. I there's this really incredible interview with Kamala where the interviewer asked her like, "How come you kind of say the same thing over and over and over again?" And she's like, "That's discipline. It's because I'm disciplined." And it goes back to like your question about the Mormon niceness, right? Like we we act the way we think we're supposed to act. Like I'm gonna I'm gonna present myself to the external world in the way that the external world is going to validate, or or I have to say the right thing, you know. And Donald Trump never says the right thing.
Right.
It, the and the fact that he never says the right thing is what makes him like why tens of millions of people voted for him
Yeah.
is because he never says the right thing. It's always you can disagree with him 100%, but at least you're like, well, at least he's saying what he feels, you know, like
Right.
because we
Right.
all want that. We
Hmm.
just want reality. And Father Paul talks about how, you know, and like I'm not trying to degrade anything about Christianity by mentioning Jesus Christ in the same sentence as any of our politicians, because that's not fair. But, you know, Christ was not a nice guy. He
Hmm.
was he was kind. He was pure love, but he wasn't nice. Like
Hmm.
he didn't tell people what they want to hear. He didn't go around like appeasing to people's emotions or, you know, he just was exactly what God is, which is love. And that
Right.
love is sometimes, as we all have experienced, love is not always milk and cookies, you know?
Right. 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 Yeah. No. No. I totally agree with you. And that's sort of the other thing that really fascinates me about these ideologies is that they paint it in, or they excuse all of these other things and this behavior because of the greater good in their view, right? So it's kind of like the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think it's the same for a lot of these ideas where, yeah, I mean, there are marginalized groups in society today, but the way by which we help those people become or sort of pick themselves up is not by the niceness approach of just giving them things, right? I think it's more along the lines of what you mentioned, where it's, what can I do to help you build yourself up into the person that can get it by themselves? And that's where I
Hmm.
think that distinction isn't always made. Um, so Stephen, um, needless to say, your story is fascinating. Everything that you've done to this point is, I think, has always, it's so interesting because I hear stories like yours, and it always seems like, even since the very beginning, there was a reason why you were involved in everything, and you met everybody that you did, and there was a sort of, um, I don't know if it's destiny, but there does seem that God has a plan for all of us. So um, I always ask my guests to see if there was something that you wish anybody could take away from this conversation. Um, what do you think that would be?
I think a lot about like my children, and what they like. I see them, you know, one of them in their 20s, one of them's 18, one of them's 16, and they have like their whole life ahead of them. And part of you like that if you've struggled at all in your life or have been through any kind of hell, you look at people you love and you go, I do not want you to suffer. What
Mm-hmm.
advice can I
Mm-hmm.
give you to, and I think we all feel that way. But but I would say that far more than avoiding suffering, I think the most important thing for any human being that seeks truth, you have to go toward the suffering. You have to be fearless about whatever you're going to encounter on the road, wherever you're going to end up. You have to be okay with every possible outcome, and your sole focus should be the truth. And you have to demand that in every conversation you have, every time you're standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, every time you're scrolling on your social media app. You have to demand the truth be present in your life so that you can be the loving thing that you are all the time. And if you don't demand that, something else will take you down the river and turn you into its own. And that's really, I guess, what I've experienced the hard way in a lot of ways. And there's certainly lots of things I wish I would not have done, but I can't look back at the things I wish I would not have done and not appreciate them, not appreciate my own stupidity, because somehow God took that stupidity and redeemed it. And that's the magic of life, I think. You know.
I agree
Yeah.
with you. I agree with you, and I think that's a beautiful message to close off the episode with. So, Stephen, again, thank you so much for sharing your story and the wisdom that you've accumulated through all of this. And I really hope that we can do it again sometime in the near future, because I could probably talk to you for hours. So again, Stephen, thank you so much.
Yeah, it would be fun to get into the weeds on any particular thing and just kind of go down a rabbit hole for an hour or whatever. Yeah, but please, yeah, any time, I'd love to. Thank you
Uh,
so much. What an honor. Yeah.
thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Raphael. See ya.